This is where he lost people. A significant number of his followers had come to learn how to manifest money, health, relationships, and here was their teacher telling them that all those things were secondary. But Neville Goddard was so much more than a manifestation teacher. He was a mystic, a biblical scholar, a visionary who experienced things that would make most spiritual teachers either run from the stage or completely rethink everything they believed about the afterlife, about identity, about what it means to be alive in this world. Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I'm your host, Brian Scott. Today we're going to talk about Neville Goddard. You see, I've read 336 Neville Goddard lectures or more, and I want to talk about what nobody else is talking about. Now, I've read 336 Neville Goddard lectures on my channel, and I'm certainly sure that I've read a lot more than that. Every single one, cover to cover, for word, recorded, and published for millions of people to hear. And after all this, after 8 years of sitting with this man's words, after traveling to the exact buildings in New York City where he lived and lectured, after studying every known recording, every book, every obscure transcript that has surfaced on the internet, I can tell you something with absolute certainty. Most people who talk about Neville Goddard online have barely scratched the surface. Most people know the imagination technique, they know live in the end, they know the ladder experiment, they know the law of assumption, and that's beautiful. These are powerful teachings that I have mentioned hundreds of times on the channel. But Neville Goddard was so much more than a manifestation teacher. He was a mystic, a biblical scholar, a visionary who experienced things that would make most spiritual teachers either run from the stage or completely rethink everything they believed about the afterlife, about identity, about what it means to be alive in this world. Today, I want to take you deeper than the YouTube algorithm usually allows, especially with all the fake Neville Goddard lectures that you see that are done by AI, that are only talking about manifestation. I want to show you the Neville Goddard that almost nobody talks about. The radical theology, the bizarre and beautiful stories he told from his own life, the connections to figures you would never expect, the teaching that cost him half his audience, and the vision of the afterlife that is so strange, so specific, and so hauntingly consistent across his later lectures that once you hear it, you will never think about death the same way again. Neville Lancelot Goddard was born on February 19th, 1905 in St. Michael, Barbados, the fourth of 10 children. His father was a merchant. His brother John became a famous cricketer. At 17 years old, Neville left Barbados and sailed to New York City to study drama. Think about that. He came to America to be an actor. He started as a dancer at the Hippodrome in New York, performing in a vaudeville act called Amerique and Neville. Critics frequently remarked on his striking resemblance to Rudolph Valentino. He performed at the Palace Theatre, toured Europe, danced at Ciro's in London, the Winter Garden in Berlin, the Ambassador in Paris. And during a tour through England in 1925, something happened that changed everything. He met a Scotsman, possibly a man named Arthur Begbie, possibly Arthur Findlay. The records are debated to this day, who handed him a stack of books about the power of the mind. Neville devoured every single one of them from that moment. The trajectory of his entire life shifted. He left the stage, he left performing, and he found Abdullah. Abdullah was an Ethiopian rabbi living in Harlem in the 1930s. He taught Neville Hebrew, the Kabbalah, and the hidden psychological meaning of Scripture. For 7 years, Neville studied under this man. 7 years. And here's what most people miss. Abdullah was intense. Israel Regardie, the famous occultist who was Aleister Crowley's personal secretary, wrote about Neville's early years with Abdullah. Regardie personally attended Neville's lectures and wrote an entire portrait of him in a book called The Romance of Metaphysics. He described Neville during those years as fanatically vegetarian, extremely disciplined, almost rigid. And then something broke open. Regardie wrote that Neville shed all of that rigidity and became, in his words, that rare anomaly, a human being. That is important. Neville's early development was ascetic and hard. It was Abdullah who gave him the raw material, the Hebrew, the Kabbalistic framework, the understanding that every character in the Bible represents a psychological state within you. And then Neville took that material and turned it into something entirely his own. He started lecturing in 1938 in a tiny room in New York where, as Regardie described it, dozens of petty little lecturers held their sway. A handful of people came at first, but Neville had something that almost nobody in the metaphysical world had. He was a trained performer. He had a stage presence. He had timing. He had a voice that could hold a room, and within a few years he was filling the old Actors Church 3 nights a week with a massive, enthusiastic audience. So let's stay with Israel Regardie for a moment, because this is one of those connections that almost nobody in the Neville Goddard community talks about. Regardie was a significant figure in Western occultism. He was Aleister Crowley's secretary. He wrote extensively about ceremonial magic, the Golden Dawn, and practical occult techniques, and he personally knew Neville. He sat in Neville's audience. He watched the man work. In The Romance of Metaphysics, Regardie wrote one of the most revealing early portraits of Neville that exists. He described watching Neville lecture with a calm, collected poise that disguised the nervousness underneath. He analyzed Neville's method, how Neville understood that his audience had emotional connections to early religious training, and knew how to tap into that stored emotional energy to create real transformation. Regardie called Neville's system the most magical of all metaphysical systems he had encountered. Let me say that again. The man who worked with Aleister Crowley, who studied ceremonial magic at the highest levels, called Neville Goddard's approach the most magical system he had ever seen. And here's the detail that almost everyone misses in at least one early lecture. And Israel Regardie was present in the audience. Neville references a friend, a psychologist, a Freudian, someone who had served in World War II, who attended his lecture but always kept his feet firmly planted on the ground. That friend was Regardie. Neville tried to explain his technique for getting discharged from the army through imagination alone, and Regardie resisted the explanation, yet he kept coming back to hear Neville speak. There's something extraordinary about that image, the ceremonial magician sitting in the audience of the biblical mystic, watching, analyzing, unable to fully accept the simplicity of the method, yet unable to walk away from its power. One of the most famous and yet still underappreciated stories Neville ever told was how he used his own technique to get honorably discharged from the United States Army during World War II. Neville was drafted in 1942. He had a wife, a young daughter, and a thriving lecture career. He had absolutely zero interest in military service, and rather than fight the draft through legal channels, he decided to test his own teaching at the highest possible stakes. He lay on his bunk at Camp Gruber in Oklahoma and imagined himself back in New York, sleeping in his own bed in his own apartment with his wife beside him. He felt the sheets, he felt the pillow, he felt the familiar weight of his own mattress. He persisted in this imaginal act night after night after night. And within months, he received an honorable discharge. The Army simply let him go. He walked out of Camp Gruber a free man and resumed his lectures in New York City, as though the interruption had been a minor inconvenience. The story was so extraordinary that it caught the attention of the New Yorker magazine, which published a profile of Neville in 1943 under the title "A Blue Flame on the Forehead." Think about that. The New Yorker, one of the most prestigious literary publications in America at that time, found this Barbadian mystic interesting enough to profile while the country was in the middle of a world war. This is a testament to the sheer force of his personality and the strangeness of his message. This is also the story that Regardie referenced when he described Neville trying to explain the technique to him. Goddard, the trained psychologist and occultist, heard the explanation and resisted it. The simplicity was the obstacle. Neville was saying, I lay in my bunk and imagined myself home, and then I went home. There was no ritual, no ceremony, no invocation, just consciousness directed with precision and sustained with absolute faith. Here's a story Neville told in his lectures that very few people reference, and I think it reveals something important about who this man really was. Neville took LSD with a doctor friend. The original plan was for Aldous Huxley, yes, that Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World and Doors of Perception, to observe the experiment and record their reactions on tape. But Huxley was sick that night and could only attend on a separate occasion, so two other observers came with recording equipment, and Neville and the doctor took the maximum dose. Neville described what happened with characteristic bluntness. He said the experience was pure distortion. Walls became alive, the wallpaper moved. He and the doctor could share the same hallucinations. They could look at the same object and discuss it, both seeing the same vision. But Neville was unimpressed. He said it took 3 times the dosage to affect him compared to Huxley. He said the experience lasted about 48 hours and left him in a peculiar state, and that the entire thing was, in his words, nothing compared to the visions he had experienced naturally through his own consciousness. It's a remarkable statement. Here's a man who was offered a chemical doorway into altered states and came back saying, I already go further than this every night without any substance at all. In fact, that Neville moved in circles that included Aldous Huxley tells you something about the caliber of intellectual company he kept. This was the mid-century Los Angeles mystical scene at its peak. Writers, philosophers, consciousness explorers all converging in the same city at the same time, and Neville was right in the middle of it. In July of 1951, Neville delivered a series of radio lectures on station KECA in Los Angeles. These are among the few surviving audio recordings of his actual voice from that era. They cover the core teachings, imagination, assumption, feeling, prayer, delivered with a clarity and directness that is almost startling when you hear them for the first time. But the bigger story is the television show. In the mid-50s, Neville hosted a program simply called Neville on KTTV Channel 11 in Los Angeles. 26 episodes, half-hour segments, Sunday afternoons at 1 o'clock. He sat at a desk and spoke extemporaneously about biblical esotericism for 30 minutes at a time without notes. The first episode generated 5,000 letters from viewers. 5,000. The station immediately locked him in for a full series. His weekly audience was estimated at over 300,000 people. And here's the path that hurts. There's zero known surviving footage of any of these broadcasts. The technology of the era worked against preservation. Videotape was expensive. Stations routinely recorded over previous episodes or cut them into strips for commercial use. The same process that destroyed the first decade of Johnny Carson's Tonight Show was destroyed every frame of Neville Goddard on television. He also appeared multiple times on the Joe Pine Show between 1965 and 1967, and contemporaries noted that he could recite and interpret the Bible in original Greek and Hebrew from memory, debating fundamental theologians without ever opening a physical text. Imagine that scene. A man from Barbados who started as a dancer, standing on live television, quoting scripture in its original languages from memory and holding his ground against trained theologians. And this brings us to the core of what made Neville so extraordinary and so controversial. Neville taught us that the Bible is entirely about you. Every character, every event, every miracle, every betrayal, every resurrection, it's all happening inside human consciousness. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, Jesus. These are states of awareness that every human being moves through on their journey of awakening. He treated this as far more than a loose poetic interpretation. He meant it literally. It was something he believed and taught and demonstrated through his own mystical experiences. That the events described in Scripture are an exact blueprint of what happens inside the consciousness of every person who wakes up to their true nature. And he lived it. Neville described in vivid detail across dozens of lectures his own experience of the events described in Gospels. He experienced the birth from within. he called being born from above, where he found himself inside his own skull, heard a vibration that became explosive, and then was pushed out through a passage and emerged as a newborn with witnesses present, exactly as described in the Nativity story. He experienced David, the David of Scripture, appearing before him in vision and calling him Father. He experienced the dove descending upon him. He experienced the splitting of the temple veil. Each of these events, he said, happened to him personally in his own consciousness, in exact correspondence with the biblical text. I've read every lecture where he describes these experiences. I've read them slowly, carefully, multiple times. And I will tell you this, either Neville Goddard was the most committed and elaborate storyteller of the 20th century, or something genuinely extraordinary was happening to this man. There's zero ambiguity in his accounts. He describes specific dates, physical sensations, the faces of beings he encounters. He describes waking his wife to tell her what happened. He describes the way these experiences transformed his understanding permanently and irreversibly. This is the Neville that most YouTube channels skip over because it's harder to package. I know this for a fact because when I would read a lecture from Neville that was about the promise, it didn't do as well. People didn't want to watch it. They were only interested in the manifestation lectures. I've even had people tell me they simply don't like when he talks about the Bible, and they don't like the promise. They think it's unusual and hard to understand. It refuses to fit neatly into a manifest your dream life thumbnail. But for Neville, that was the entire point. If you want to understand the deeper Neville, you have to understand William Blake. Blake was an English poet, painter, and visionary who lived from 1757 to 1827. Blake was amazing. He saw angels in trees. He saw devils in priests. He wrote that the human imagination is God itself. He rejected organized religion while passionately embracing the Christ within. He lived and died in relative obscurity, dismissed by his contemporaries as a madman. Neville felt a profound kinship with Blake that went beyond intellectual admiration. He wrote, "I know the truth of that statement, for although Blake was born in 1757 and died in 1827, we are closely woven in the tapestry of thought." Neville quoted Blake constantly in his lectures, treating Blake as if it was the same as the Bible. The line from Blake that most deeply resonated with Neville's teaching was this: man is all imagination. God is man and exists in us and we in him. The eternal body of man is the imagination and he is God himself. For Neville, Blake was part of that someone else who had seen the same vision, had experienced the same reality centuries earlier. Blake's marriage of heaven and hell, his prophetic books, his visionary paintings, all of it confirmed for Neville that the inner experience he was having was real, repeatable, and was described in Scripture for exactly this purpose. He gave an entire lecture called Blake on Religion, where he argued that Blake understood the Bible more deeply than any theologian, more deeply than any church father, because Blake experienced its truth directly through vision rather than parsing it through intellect. Neville considered Blake a spiritual brother across time. And here is a remarkable detail: the German expressionist painter Max Beckmann reportedly having a vision of William Blake appearing before him and promising him solace through the recognition of beauty in higher realms of perception. Neville referenced this story repeatedly in his lectures, using it as evidence that Blake continued to appear in vision to those who were attuned to the same frequency of consciousness, even centuries after his physical death. So now we arrive at the part of Neville's story that separates the casual students from the committed ones. The part that most manifestation channels either skip entirely or mention only in passing. The part that costs Neville a significant portion of his audience. It's the promise. For the first 2 decades of teaching, Neville focused primarily on what he called the law, the practical application of imagination to change your circumstance. Live in the end. Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled. Your imagination creates reality. This is the Neville that the internet knows and loves. But in 1959, something happened. Neville began experiencing a series of mystical events visions, encounters, internal revelations that he recognized as the fulfillment of scriptural prophecy within his own consciousness. He called this the promise. He later wrote, "I did not know of the promise until I began to experience it and have it revealed in me." From that point forward, Neville's teaching shifted dramatically. He still taught the law, but just not as much. He still showed people how to use imagination to transform their lives, but he increasingly emphasized that manifestation was temporary. He said you could use the law to make wealth, become famous, achieve anything in this world, but it would all be lost as smoke. The real purpose of human existence, he said, was to fulfill the promise, to awaken to your true identity as God, to experience the scriptural drama within your own being as Christ, and to graduate from this cycle of earthly experience entirely. This is where he lost people. A significant number of his followers had come to learn how to manifest money, health, relationships, and here was their teacher telling them that all those things were secondary. The real purpose of being alive was to undergo a series of mystical experiences described in ancient scripture. He said it plainly. The promise takes precedence over the law. And he kept teaching it relentlessly for the remaining 13 years of his life. He described the promise as unconditional, a gift, pure grace. He said you do absolutely nothing to earn it. It comes in its own time, and everyone eventually would experience it. The only question was whether you experience it in this lifetime or in another. And this is where Neville's teaching becomes truly radical, because his view of the afterlife is like nothing you will find in any major religion, any New Age teaching, any metaphysical system. Neville taught that when you die, if you have yet to experience the promise in full, you pass through a door. That's it. Death is simply a door. And on the other side, you're instantly restored to life in a world exactly like this one. But here's the specific detail that separates Neville's teaching from reincarnation, from any Eastern framework, from anything else. You come back young. He said you are restored to a body around 20 years of age. You carry the same identity, the same essential self, but you are young and whole. If you left this old, blind, crippled on the other side, you arrive young, healthy, and complete. And then you live again. You grow, you marry, you face the same kinds of problems, and you die again with all the same fear of death that you had there, because you have no memory of having lived before. The amnesia is total. This is a form of what he called recursion. You inhabit what feels like the same timeline, or sometimes a different timeline, sometimes in the future or sometimes in the past, but always as this young version of yourself, always without any conscious memory of the previous cycle. You repeat this process until the promise unfolds within you and you graduate permanently from this cycle. He was very specific about this. He said the world on the other side is just as solid, just as real, just as challenging as this one. People there marry, have children, pursue goals, suffer, hope, dream, all with absolute conviction. That they are living for the first time. He described meeting people in what appeared to be dream states, people who had died in this world, and finding them healthy, young, going about their lives with no awareness of having ever lived before. He was deliberately vague about how these meetings occurred. He implied they happened through dreams or visions, but he rarely specified the exact mechanism. What he was emphatic about was the reality of those encounters. He described them as more vivid than waking life, more solid, more real. He would tell his audiences about seeing someone who had recently died and finding that person completely well, completely alive, and unaware of any transition. Now, I want you to sit with how radical this is. This is a model where physical death is essentially meaningless, a transition so seamless that the one who dies fails to even register it. There is zero judgment, zero punishment, zero karma in the traditional sense. There's only the continuation of the journey toward awakening played out across as many cycles as it takes. He said of the promise, you do absolutely nothing to earn it. It's a gift. It's all grace. God's promise is unconditional. God's law is conditional. The law requires your participation. You must assume, you must imagine, you must persist. But the promise comes on its own schedule, by its own power, and when it arrives, the cycle ends. One of the things I have thought deeply about is whether Neville's vision of the promise and the recursive afterlife connects to anything else in the world's spiritual literature. The Tibetan Buddhist concept of the bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth, shares certain structural similarities. In the Tibetan model, consciousness passes through a series of visionary experiences after death before entering a new incarnation. But the key difference is that in the Tibetan framework, there is karmic momentum and some degree of continuity. In Neville's model, the continuity is identity itself, stripped of all memory. William Blake wrote extensively about what he called states, conditions of consciousness that human beings move through. Blake taught that you are never your state. You pass through poverty, you pass through illness, you pass through grief, but you are always the eternal imagination wearing these states temporarily. Neville built directly on this framework and extended it past the boundary of physical death. Even death is a state you pass through. The Gnostic tradition, particularly the Valentinian school, taught that the divine spark within each human being would eventually return to the pleroma, the fullness of God, after passing through a series of experiences designed to awaken self-knowledge. Neville's promise mirrors this almost exactly. The divine being within you, asleep and dreaming this human life, eventually awakens and returns to the source. The Hindu concept of moksha, liberation from samsara, the cycle of birth and death, is perhaps the closest structural parallel. Moksha represents the permanent exit from the wheel. Neville's promise is moksha, expressed in Christian mystical language rather than Sanskrit. Even Aldous Huxley, moved in the same circles as Neville in Los Angeles, used the term moksha in his final novel, Island, as the name for the liberating substance. Whether Huxley and Neville ever discussed the parallel directly is unknown. They were breathing the same intellectual air. Then there's quantum physics, the many worlds interpretation, which suggests that every possibility exists as an actual reality. Neville's description of inhabiting different timelines after death, sometimes the future, sometimes the past, resonates with this framework in a way that would have been impossible for his audiences to recognize in the 60s. He was describing a multiverse experience decades before physics gave it a name. Neville Goddard died on October 1st, 1972 at the age of 67. For years, the cause was reported as a heart attack, but in 2022, historian Mitch Horowitz corrected the record. The death certificate states the cause as an esophageal rupture. And then there's the account of Frank Carter. Frank Carter was a close friend of Neville's and one of his most devoted students. He spent the last day of Neville's life with him. Mrs. Goddard was in the hospital at the time, seriously ill. According to Carter, Neville appeared to know exactly when he was going to leave. He left behind 2 documents, one formal and one handwritten. But the truly extraordinary part of Frank Carter's account is the vision he had 3 years before Neville's death. Carter described seeing Neville in front of a restaurant beginning to speak, then suddenly choking and falling backward. When Neville fell, his body split open. It was violent, disturbing, visceral. Carter could barely bring himself to describe it. For 3 years, Carter held its vision in silence. During that entire time, Neville was saying from the lecture platform, "I'd love to hear that you have seen me die." He was inviting the students to share death visions of him. And Carter, who had the most vivid and disturbing vision of all, still found himself unable to speak. Then one night, Carter was reading scripture and his eyes fell on Acts chapter 1, the description of the death of Judas. Peter is speaking, describing how Judas, who had been numbered among the apostles, purchased a field with the reward of his iniquity, and falling headlong, he burst asunder in the midst of all his bowels gushed out. Carter was electrified. He called Neville immediately. He said, "Neville, you are Judas." And Neville's response was instant and certain. Yes, Judas betrayed the messianic secret. For Neville, Judas was the one who revealed the secret to the world. The betrayal was the act of making the hidden knowledge public. And his own death, Carter believed, fulfilled the scriptural description exactly. When Neville was found, he'd been bleeding from his ears and nose, consistent with a rupture, consistent with the violent imagery of the Judas account. After Neville's death, Mrs. Goddard referred to his passing as his ascension. She never elaborated on why she chose that word, but in February of 1974, she told Carter something remarkable. She said she had fused with Neville. She offered it almost as a throwaway comment, gave no details, and refused to say more. Carter was stunned. He took it to mean she had experienced a vision of union with Neville on the other side. Carter gave a series of lectures in 1976, 4 years after Neville's death, in which he laid out his belief that Neville's death had fulfilled Scripture, that this man had literally stepped out of the pages of the Bible, delivered the secret to the world, and then departed in exact accordance with the biblical text. Carter said of Neville, "This man stepped out of the pages of Scripture and came to us and gave us the great secret and told us, whatever we do, do not worship him. This is all for the awakening." I traveled to New York City and walked through the places where Neville lived and lectured. I stood outside the buildings where he held those early talks in the late 30s. Steinway Hall, where he booked his first independent lecture in 1938, and finishing years with Abdullah. I visited the area around West 48th and 49th Streets where the old Actors Church stood, like St. Malachi's, where Rigardi described those packed 3-night-a-week audiences. I went to the area near Town Hall, the prestigious Midtown venue where Neville lectured through the 1940s as his audience grew. There's something that happens when you stand in the physical spaces where transformative ideas were first spoken aloud. You realize that these were real rooms, real buildings, real streets where a man from Barbados with a dancer's poise and a prophet's conviction stood up and told the people of New York City that they were God, that the Bible was about them, that their imagination was the creative force of the universe. And they came, thousands of them, week after week, year after year, for over 3 decades. You know, I've thought deeply about Neville Goddard's life, and one of the things I feel most strongly about is this. He was a magnificent writer and speaker who felt entirely unique. His prose style is unlike any other teacher in the metaphysical tradition. Joseph Murphy, who called Neville one of the world's great mystics, wrote in a clear and practical style. Florence Scovel Shinn was accessible and warm. Ernest Holmes was systematic, but Neville was amazing. He was writing moves the way music moves. It builds, it layers, it shifts between registers. He can begin a lecture at a level anyone can understand, and within 30 minutes be operating at a level of theological sophistication that could challenge any seminary professor. He wrote 10 books. He delivered hundreds, possibly thousands of lectures. Many of these have not been recorded. And running through every single one of them is this unshakable conviction that he had found something real, something that could be tested, something that could be experienced, something that was available to every human being alive. He unlocked a new meaning for the Bible. He genuinely did. Whether you agree with his interpretation or think he was entirely wrong, you have to reckon with the fact that his reading of Scripture is internally consistent, astonishingly creative, and powerful enough to have sustained a global following more than 50 years after his death. What I find fascinating is Wikipedia removed Neville for a very long time because he was so controversial. He took a book that billions of people treat as external history and reframed it as an internal instruction manual for the awakening of the divine within you. Every parable, every miracle, every genealogy, he found the psychological meaning in it. And he did this from memory on stage in real time with references to the original Greek and Hebrew, connecting passages from Genesis to Revelation in a web of meaning so intricate that after reading 336 lectures, I'm still finding connections I had missed. Neville always made clear that the promise was universal. It was happening to others. In his later lectures, he would regularly share accounts from students and friends who had experienced fragments of the promise, the birth from within, the vision of David, the dove, the splitting of the veil. He treated these accounts as evidence. Each one confirmed the pattern. Each one demonstrated the scriptural sequence was playing out inside ordinary human beings, people with ordinary lives, people who had come to his lectures looking for help with their rent or their marriage and had stumbled into something cosmic. He encouraged his audiences to share their experiences openly. He said these inner events needed witnesses, needed to be spoken aloud, needed to become part of the collective record. He was building a body of testimony, a living, growing archive of human beings who were experiencing the ancient promise of Scripture in their own bodies, in their own consciousness, in the middle of the 20th century America. Scattered throughout Neville's lectures are dozens of small, strange, fascinating stories that rarely get mentioned by anyone covering his work online. There are gems I found buried deep in those 300 some odd lectures. He tells a friend, a Catholic priest he calls David, who lost $2 million on Wall Street. The priest was the one who originally introduced Neville to Abdullah. Think about the chain of events. A Catholic priest loses a fortune in the stock market, introduces a Barbadian dancer to an Ethiopian rabbi in Harlem, and from that introduction, the entire reality revolution unfolds across the next century. He tells the story of his friend Alice Bentley, who had a space in Carnegie Hall that she rented out to extraordinary figures, including Uspensky and Gurdjieff, the great Fourth Way teachers. Neville moved in a world where the major mystical and philosophical movements of the 20th century were all intersecting in the same rooms, the same buildings, the same city blocks of Midtown Manhattan. He tells stories of encounters in the dream state that blur every line between waking and sleeping reality. People who had died appeared to him in full three-dimensional vividness, going about their lives, eating meals, having conversations, completely unaware that they had transitioned. He describes these encounters with calm precision of a field researcher documenting observations, never sensationalizing, never embellishing, simply reporting what he saw. And running through all of these stories is a consistent thread. Reality is far larger, far stranger, and far more alive than the thin slice we experience with our physical senses. Neville lived in an expanded reality. He inhabited a world where the dead walk, where Scripture is alive and unfolding in human consciousness. Right now, where a single imaginal act performed in a bunk in Oklahoma can override the entire machinery of the United States military. He spent 35 years standing on stages trying to convince us that we live that same expanded reality. We have simply forgotten how to see it. In the last years of his life, Neville spoke with increasing urgency and clarity about his own departure. He said, "I know my time is short. I finished the work I've been sent to do, and I am now eager to depart. I know I will appear in this three-dimensional world again, for the promise has been fulfilled in me." He said he would appear in the three-dimensional world again in one lecture. He was applying his own teaching to himself because the promise had been fulfilled in him. He believed he had graduated from the cycle. He would return, but as something other than what he had been. The recursive loop was broken. And then he added something extraordinary. "As for where I go, I will know you there as I have known you here. For we are all brothers, infinitely in love with each other." It's one of the most beautiful sentences in the entire canon of mystical literature, and it came from a man who started life as a fourth child of a Barbadian merchant family, who came to America to be a dancer, who met an Ethiopian rabbi in Harlem, who taught himself Hebrew and Greek and filled auditoriums from New York to Los Angeles for 35 years, who took LSD with Aldous Huxley and shrugged, who appeared on television to an audience of 300,000 people, who described experiencing the events of the Gospels in his own body, and who died at 67 with his friend Frank Carter nearby and a handwritten note left behind. I've read 336 or more lectures, and I can tell you, we've barely begun to understand what he was trying to tell us. The manifestation technique is real. It works. I've seen it work in my life and in the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in this community. But it is the beginning of the journey. The promise is where the journey leads. After reading all those lectures, I came to a realization that a lot of what he was teaching was very similar. And I started to have moments where I would have Neville come to me. Neville always would come to me when I would read his lectures, and I would just sit prior to sleep and I could have conversations with Neville. And so one time Neville came to me and he said, "I think it's time for you to move on. You've taken all the lectures that I've given, and it's now time for you to take this to the next level." And so when people had asked me, "Why'd you stop reading Neville?" It wasn't because I was moving away from my beliefs in Neville or saying that anything about his teachings was less than what it was. It was just time for us to take it to the next level. And if Neville was right, if the Bible really is about you, if the events of Scripture really do unfold within human consciousness, if death really is just a door and we really do come back young and whole and unaware, cycling through until the divine spark within us finally ignites and we remember what we are, then we are living inside the most extraordinary story ever told, and you are the main character. Before I go, I want to invite you to join the Reality Revolution community, where I host weekly group sessions. You can find exclusive content with audiobooks and meditations that are only available in my community. We have networking sessions and masterminds with an amazing group of people that are all working together for you to achieve your goal. You can find the link in the description. It's at www.school.com/reality revolution. I'm sending all my light and love to everyone. And if you're in that path on the Neville journey, keep going. And it will only help in this process. He's such a unique voice, and I'm so excited. If you've just been introduced to Neville and you're going down that path, then keep on reading, because every lecture holds wonderful, beautiful little tidbits that help expand who you are, awakening to your divinity. You can find all episodes of The Reality Revolution at therealityrevolution.com. The website's been updated, so you can check the website to find information about events that we're hosting. We have an event that we're hosting in Maui in May 14th through the 17th. We have an event in Anaheim in July. We have an event in Austin in September and in Sedona in November. I hope to see you at one of those events. They're amazing, and I'm sending all my love to everyone. And welcome to the Reality Revolution. Hey, it's Brian Scott. So before you go, November 20th through the 22nd in Sedona at Bell Rock in the Vortex, 3 days of pineal gland activations, quantum jumping, future self merging. I'm using a special retrocausal technique where you merge with your future self based on real quantum physics that creates the most drastic and profound changes that you could ever imagine. The Earth is going to do half the work in the Vortex. Tickets are in the description. Space is very limited. You can go to the link, click the link, or go to www.brianscottlive.com/Sedona-2026. Sedona, Arizona, November 20th through the 22nd. There's early bird pricing available. There's discounts on rooms available. Get your ticket now. Click on the link now. I can't wait to see you there.